Hydroxychloroquine, is it effective? Well, I'll show you the data, we'll walk through it together, and then I'll leave it up to you to be the judge. Coming up next on SciTalks 2.0. Hello and welcome everybody to another exciting episode of SciTalks 2.0. As always, my name is Dr. Jack Saxenian. For those of you who are joining me for the first time, I just want to give a quick background about myself. I'm a physician scientist, MD, PhD, who has been very closely following the ongoing pandemic. I've pretty much read all the papers that have come out and specifically related to therapeutics and the disease mechanism underlying the COVID disease. So having said that, today I want to discuss about a topic that's been in the news the last few days and has become a very hotly debated issue. And this is the topic related to the effectiveness of hydroxychloroquine. As a scientist myself, I believe that decisions and advances should be made based on data, accumulation of evidence, and then a consensus built around this body of work. And if the data shows one way or another, you cannot allow your preconceived notions to impede the way you interpret and the decisions you make subsequently. So therefore, instead of debating whether hydroxychloroquine is effective or not, and we could turn blue and not get to an answer, what I want to do today is present to you 5 papers that have been published on this topic. Of course, there's way more. There's about 65 that are published, but I picked the 5 latest ones that have been published in various journals. Most of them have been peer-reviewed except one, and I want to go over what the findings of these papers are and just describe it to you. We could and go over the data and how the clinical trial was designed or the study was designed, and then I will leave it up to you, the viewer, to make a decision based on these findings whether you think hydroxychloroquine is effective and should be used and prescribed, or whether you think that the evidence is lacking and therefore it is correct not to be endorsing this as a medication for COVID-19. I will give you the papers and I will post the link to these papers at the bottom of the description in the YouTube channel. So again, I picked 5 papers just so that I don't make this video too long and bore everybody too much. So I will stick to the 5, and again, these show various results one way or another, so I want the audience, the viewer, to make the decision. But before we get started, I just want to ask you a favor. Please don't forget to hit that subscription button if you've been enjoying these SciTalk videos, and not only hit the subscription button but hit the notification bell so that when new videos are uploaded you are notified and can watch them. In the meantime, I want to thank you all who have been a tremendous support and have been following me and watching my videos. So with that, let's get started on the first paper and let's dissect it together. Okay, so in this first paper, this was not peer-reviewed. It's been published in bioRxives, which means it hasn't gone through the peer review process, but the data has been uploaded for scientists to be able to scrutinize. And this is a really important step in the scientific progress, where your peers and your colleagues are able to see the data that you produced and the claims that you make and are able to scrutinize it. So let's take a look at this first study coming out of Delhi, India, where they looked at the prevalence and clinical correlates of COVID-19 outbreak among healthcare workers. So they were studying in general some of the parameters among healthcare workers, including whether they received hydroxychloroquine and whether having hydroxychloroquine affected their chances of getting infected by the SARS-2 coronavirus. So this study is not one of the best in terms of the gold standards. The gold standard studies are randomized clinical trials. This is a retrospective study where they go back and look at the healthcare workers that were working in the hospitals treating COVID patients, and then looked at the parameters and wanted to find if there are any correlations, right? So these types of retrospective studies, the best that you could do is come up with correlations. You can't, by the nature of these design studies, describe any cause of causality. The only way to do a causality study is a randomized controlled clinical trial, which is the gold standard. But let's take it for what it is, and let's take a look at how this was done and what the findings were in this paper. And this is a very recent paper published not too long ago, about 3-4 days ago, before the taping of this video. So again, the title of this paper is "The Prevalence and Clinical Correlates of COVID-19 Outbreak Among Healthcare Workers in a Tertiary Level Hospital in Delhi." So let's take a look at the abstract, what it says. In the abstract, it says that in this study, we summarize the epidemiological characteristics of COVID-19 outbreak among healthcare workers in a tertiary hospital and compared various parameters and preventive measures taken by those healthcare workers, and compared them with those healthcare workers who were not COVID positive, right? So they took COVID positive healthcare workers and COVID negative healthcare workers and said, are there things that were different that they did that made them more susceptible to becoming infected, or things that prevented them from becoming infected? So in this setting, when we looked at specifically hydroxychloroquine, we could think of this as a prophylactic potential of hydroxychloroquine in preventing you from getting the infection. So in this design, the question that you can ask is, if the healthcare worker received hydroxychloroquine, did it prevent them from being infected by the coronavirus? So let's take a look at what the findings were and the methodology, right? So when we look at specifically the section up here, which says prophylactic agents used by healthcare workers, what we see is that there was a significant difference between the various groups in terms of distribution of prophylactic hydroxychloroquine intake. So what they found is that those who got the virus versus those who did not, there was a difference in the amount of hydroxychloroquine that they took. And so they did this, what's called a chi-square analysis, fancy statistics. All it means is, can we prove if it's statistically significant? And they found that, wow, there's a difference between COVID positive versus COVID negative healthcare workers in terms of hydroxychloroquine intake. In fact, those that were positive for COVID, 6.4% of them ended up taking hydroxychloroquine, whereas those that were negative, 18.4% of them took hydroxychloroquine. So what this suggests is that the ones that did not get the infection were more likely to have taken hydroxychloroquine for 7 weeks or more, right? So based on this, one can conclude that, well, taking hydroxychloroquine has a protective effect. But when reading these kinds of papers, you always have to look at the details, because the details are what's very important, right? So let's take a look at the details and continue reading it. The other thing that they found was that those who took the hydroxychloroquine and ended up taking other supplements such as vitamin C, vitamin D, or zinc, had no extra additive effect to taking the hydroxychloroquine, right? So whether you took hydroxychloroquine with or without zinc, it really did not have any effect, right? So the protective thing that they found was that taking hydroxychloroquine meant that you are less likely to get the infection. But here's the other major part that they added at the very end here. Okay, what they found was that in addition to taking hydroxychloroquine, people that were negative for the coronavirus were more likely to have used masks and protective equipment. So here what they found was that amongst people that were taking hydroxychloroquine, right, 30.9% of the participants used prophylaxis other than hydroxychloroquine, right? While in the negative group, right, 20% used other prophylaxis, right? So what this is telling you is that those who take the hydroxychloroquine, in addition, had use of other strategies in the form of prophylaxis, right? Which included N95 masks and other protective measures. So here, if we look at the findings of the study, what they're concluding, and this is directly from the author's conclusion, is that findings of present study found some protective role of full course 7 weeks of prophylactic hydroxychloroquine compared to a group of negative healthcare workers, and they found this to be statistically significant because the p-value here is less than 0.05, and the use of N95 masks over others. Our results did not show any added protective protection using other forms of prophylaxis such as vitamin C, zinc, or other kinds of prophylactic measures. So at best, what can we conclude from this study is that yes, even though they show that those who got infected versus those who did not, there was a difference in the amount of people, that the healthcare workers who took hydroxychloroquine. But the confounding factor here is that those who were negative for the virus were more likely to wear an N95 masks. So here we could see a direct confounder in the results of this study, right? Because it's been shown that if you wear the N95 mask, the chances of you getting infected is much lower than somebody who doesn't. So from this specific study, which is again not the best because it's a retrospective study, one can say yes, there might be a prophylactic effect of hydroxychloroquine, but it's hard to tell because there's a confounder, and that confounder is that N95 masks were more likely to be used in the group that was negative for hydroxychloroquine. So this paper is kind of a wash, right? It's really hard to tell if there was any benefit. In fact, if you were a very strict scientist, you would say, I don't think there's any data here that shows any efficacy because it's being polluted, quote unquote, by the N95 masks, right? So this is the first paper. It just came out a few days ago, and therefore I wanted to start with this, and it kind of addresses whether hydroxychloroquine has any prophylactic purposes in people who were not sick, right? So let's take a look at the second paper, which again was just recently published about a week ago in the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, this has gone through a peer review, which means the data was published, but not only was it published, the colleagues, the scientific and medical community had a chance to scrutinize this before it was allowed to be published in the journal, right? And we all know and have heard of New England Journal of Medicine, which is one of the top, if not the top, journal in the medical field. So let's take a look at what this study did. In this study titled Hydroxychloroquine with or without azithromycin in mild to moderate COVID-19 patients, right? So in this case, they're treating patients with hydroxychloroquine either with or without azithromycin, right? Or Z-Pak, as most of you might know. And again, they were treating mild to moderate because the argument could be that, hey, if the patients are in really severe state of the disease, the drug might not be effective. So let's take a look at the early stages and see if it was any benefit, right? So let's take a look at how this study was conducted, right? So if we look at the methods, this is one of the gold standards of clinical trials that I was telling you guys about, which is a randomized, controlled, placebo-controlled clinical trial. So here what they did was, if we read their methods, they conducted a multi-center, randomized, open-label, 3-group controlled trial involving hospitalized patients with suspected or confirmed COVID-19 who were receiving either no supplemental oxygen or a maximum of 4 liters per minute of supplemental oxygen, right? So again, let's leave the oxygen aside, but the important thing is that it was randomized, open-label, 3-group trial, and the patients were randomly assigned to either receiving the standard of care plus hydroxychloroquine, or the standard of care plus hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin, right? And what they measured after that was whether their clinical status after 15 days improved, or if they had any differences in terms of death among these groups of patients. So what are the results? They were able to recruit 667 patients who underwent the randomization. Out of those 667, 504 patients had confirmed COVID-19 and were included in the analysis, right? So what they found was that as compared with standard of care, the proportion odds of having a higher, or the likelihood of being affected by hydroxychloroquine was actually 1.21, with the confidence interval essentially showing you that people who got hydroxychloroquine compared to the standard of care, there was no difference. This hazard ratio, because it is essentially 1.21, and the confidence interval passes over 1. So here they're showing that the confidence interval is between 0.69 to 2.11. So because it passes through 1, it tells you that there's no statistical significant difference. And the p-value here shows you that it's 1. And in order for it to be statistically significant, that p-value has to be less than 0.05, right? And they found, again, no statistical significance when they added azithromycin on top, right? Here we could see that the 95% confidence interval, again, is from 0.57 to 1.73. Because it passes through 1, there's no statistical significance. What they did find was that those who were either taking hydroxychloroquine or hydroxychloroquine with azithromycin, they had prolongation of the QT interval. And again, I don't want to go into too much detail, not to bore you guys, but this is essentially a sign that the heart is being affected, and the electrical signals that are involved in helping the heart pump, there's an effect of the drug on this electrical wiring system, right? And this could be dangerous because it could lead to arrhythmias. So even though they found no effect of hydroxychloroquine after 15 days of treatment, what they did find was a very bad adverse effect in these patients, which is the prolongation of the QT interval. So overall, if we look at their conclusion, what the authors are concluding is that among patients hospitalized with mild to moderate COVID-19, the use of hydroxychloroquine, either with or without azithromycin, did not improve clinical status at 15 days compared with the standard of care, right? And again, this was a randomized controlled clinical trial that just came out. So far we've looked at essentially two stages. Prophylactically, which means given before you've been infected, looks like maybe potentially some effect in our first study, but that was compromised by the mask. In this second study, they looked at mild to moderate disease state in hospitalized patients and gave them azithromycin with hydroxychloroquine or hydroxychloroquine alone, and they found no difference up to 15 days, right? So far, the data is not very strong in terms of advocates for hydroxychloroquine. And this study, again, it's a randomized controlled clinical trial, so it holds a lot of weight, right? So let's take a look at the third study. In this third study, we have the very popularized study coming out of Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit. Now, this has been in the news forever, and therefore I wanted to touch upon this article because it is been picked up by media and has been circulated a lot. Okay, so this was a study coming out of Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit. So if we look at the title of this article, it's called Treatment with Hydroxychloroquine, Azithromycin, and in Combination in Patients Hospitalized with COVID-19. And this was published sometimes end of June, early July, right? So it's a fairly recent study, but it's the one that is the furthest back compared to the other papers that I will be discussing and have discussed it, right? So let's take a look at what the findings of this paper was, right? Because the media has been using this a lot and has been talking about it. But let's take a look at the details, and like I said, you, the viewer, you be the judge, right? Okay, so in reading the objective of the study, the objective here was, the study was to evaluate the role of hydroxychloroquine therapy alone and in combination with azithromycin in hospitalized patients positive for COVID-19. The design of this study is a multi-center retrospective observational study, right? Again, this is not a gold standard because the gold standard is a randomized clinical trial. This is once again a retrospective observational study, and the only thing that you could conclude from these are correlations, no causation, right? So let's take a look at how the study was designed and what the main results were. Okay, so in terms of how the study was designed, they looked at consecutive patients hospitalized with COVID-19 in their healthcare system between March 10 to May 2, 2020. And All patients that were evaluated were 18 years of age and older and were treated as inpatients for at least 48 hours unless they expired within 24, right? So they had to have been hospitalized for at least 48 hours. So if they came in and left within 24 hours, they were not included in the study. And what they measured was the primary outcome was in hospital mortality, which means what percent of the people died within the hospital, right? So what are the results? Well, the results of this study was that when they looked at all their patients, they had 2,541 patients. This is a large group of patients that they looked at, right? It's a huge study. It's a retrospective study, but it's still huge. There's a lot of patients that they're looking, right? And what they found was that overall in hospital mortality was reduced by treatment with hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin, right? So if we look at the p-values again, what we see here is that overall in hospital mortality was 18.1%, but those who were treated, right? If we look at the p-value, we see that it does not, the 95% confidence interval does not cross 1, so it's significant. And therefore, what they're saying is that based on their results, right, in hospital mortality is significantly decreased when treating with either hydroxychloroquine or in combination with azithromycin, right? You might look at this data and say, well, this is clear evidence that the treatment with hydroxychloroquine significantly decreased in hospital mortality, right? And if we look at the hazard ratio, what we find was that the hazard ratios are not anything to write home about, but nonetheless, they're good, right? And therefore, we should be looking at this as a positive result. Again, this is the data, but the details are important, right? Remember, they had compared essentially 3 groups: those who got hydroxychloroquine alone, or got hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin, and then they had a third group, which was patients who did not get any of these 2 drugs. So what did those patients get, right? They got the standard of care. Well, what is the standard of care, right? So let's take a look at the data a little bit more closely. All right, so if we look at the data more closely, right, here is the chart. Let's take a look at what is happening here in the chart, in the table here. Okay, so if we look at characteristics, here they had total of 2,541 patients. Out of that, 409 got neither hydroxychloroquine or azithromycin. 1,202 got hydroxychloroquine alone. 147 of them got azithromycin alone, and 783 got hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin. So if we look at mortality, which is the first line here, we see that those that did not get any of the medication, the mortality rate was 26.4. Those that got hydroxychloroquine alone was 13.5, right? So that's almost half the patients, right? You're essentially halving it. And azithromycin, it was 22.4, and hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin was 20.1, right? These are all less than if you didn't get any of the drug, right, which was 26.4. And if we look at the p-value, it's very, 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 very significant, which says, hey, the difference that you're seeing among your treatment groups is very, very statistically significant, right? So again, this goes to show you that the data is saying giving hydroxychloroquine almost halves the mortality rate. But then the question is, what is the standard of care, right? So let's take a look at it. What they mention here is that patients here, if we look at the last line, the clinical guidelines included adjunctive immunomodulatory therapy with corticosteroids and tocilizumab. Wait a minute, what does this mean? It means that a majority of the patients in this study not only got hydroxychloroquine or azithromycin, but they got corticosteroids or tocilizumab. And why do I say these two drugs are important? Because so far, steroids have been shown to decrease mortality in hospitalized patients that have COVID-19. So we know steroids work, and there's a lot of data that shows tocilizumab, which is an antibody against IL-6, also works. So if we say, take it for what it is, the data that we have so far in this table, we can say, well, hydroxychloroquine helps. But wait, did these groups of patients receive steroids differently? So let's take a look at the second part of this table. And this is why I tell you guys, it's really important to look at the details. So if we look at the second part of the table, here once again, we have the total patients. We have those that got neither hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, or hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin. So let's take a look at what percent among these groups received steroids. Those that received that did not receive hydroxychloroquine or azithromycin, only 36% of them received steroids. Whereas those that received hydroxychloroquine, in addition to getting hydroxychloroquine, 80% of them had received steroids. Now, is this fair? Where 80% of one of the groups gets steroids, whereas in the other group, only 36% gets it? And we know steroids work. What about azithromycin alone? 38.8%. And then azithromycin plus hydroxychloroquine, 74%. So the group that they were comparing it to, which is this first group that got neither azithromycin or hydroxychloroquine, right, had almost half in terms of patients who received steroids. And we know steroids work. So this is not a fair comparison, right? This is not fair. If these numbers showed that all groups had the same percentage of patients that received steroids, then one can say, okay, maybe the effect of the hydroxychloroquine is real. But with these numbers, it's very inaccurate to conclude that the effect that we're seeing in terms of mortality is not because of the steroids, and it's due to hydroxychloroquine. Let's take a look at the second drug, tocilizumab, right? The neither group that got neither hydroxychloroquine or azithromycin, only 1.2% of them got this tocilizumab. Whereas the hydroxychloroquine group, 2.7%. And azithromycin, 3.4%. Hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin, 9.2%. And again, this shows that the patients who got azithromycin, hydroxychloroquine, or a combination had more likelihood of receiving tocilizumab, right? So this is a big confounder. And these two drugs are important because they're part of the standard of care right now, because they work, right? They've been shown in randomized clinical trials that they work. So now I urge you guys to look at this data that has been all over the news, to look at this and say, hey, is it hydroxychloroquine or is it these two other drugs that have been shown to be effective, right? You make the decision yourself, right? So I just want to present you the data, look at the numbers together, and you can make the conclusion yourself. Okay, so let's take a look at the other studies, right? Hydroxychloroquine for early treatment of adults with mild COVID, a randomized controlled trial, right? And again, this was published really recently, July 16, 2020. Again, this is a randomized study, right? A controlled clinical trial. So again, these are the gold standards, right? And then once again, they're looking at mild COVID symptom carrying patients. We already saw that in the New England Journal of Medicine paper, mild to moderate COVID patients did not show any efficacy in terms of hydroxychloroquine use. Let's take a look at this paper, right? If we look at their summary results, what we see is that the summary results shows that compared to the standard of care, early treatment with hydroxychloroquine failed to reduce the RNA viral load in the nasopharyngeal swabs after 3 to 7 days, which means they were not able to see a decrease in the amount of virus in the nose, right, when they gave the patients hydroxychloroquine, or shorten the time to complete resolution of the symptoms, right? So in summary, they found no effect, right? But let's look at the details and convince ourselves that the data was collected properly and the study was done correctly. So the method that they used, they conducted a multi-center, open-label, randomized, controlled study in Spain, right? And what they did was essentially all adult patients recently confirmed with SARS-CoV-2 infection and had the symptoms for less than 5 days, because here you're trying to see if you give it early on before symptoms become too severe, if you could prevent the growth of the virus and therefore essentially curb the disease, right? And the patients were assigned to receive hydroxychloroquine, right? Or antiviral treatments, not placebo controlled, right? So this is one of the problem with this. They're not comparing it to a group that got nothing. They're comparing it to a group that got an antiviral. So again, the antivirals could be effective, right? So if now you're comparing a drug that's effective with another drug that's effective, and if you're not finding any difference between them, maybe they're both effective, because what are you going to compare it to if you don't have a group, right? A control group. So this is one of the weaknesses of this paper, that's showing that hydroxychloroquine has no effect. Well, yeah, because maybe the placebo is lacking, right? And therefore the effect of hydroxychloroquine might be masked by the sheer fact that you're comparing it to another drug that works. But even with that caveat, let's take a look at what they found. So in their results, they saw that in 293 patients that were eligible to get it, 157 were in the control arm. By control, it means they received an antiviral treatment, right? And the other group, 136 of them received the hydroxychloroquine. And what they found was that if we look at the p-values here, and I apologize for this big blue manuscript letter, it's because it's recently published and so it's still not in its full PDF form. But essentially, if we look at the p-values are way above 0.05, so there's no statistical significance, right? So in conclusion, what they're saying is that patients with mild COVID, no benefit was observed with hydroxychloroquine compared to the usual care, right? So adding hydroxychloroquine to the standard of care, in this case antivirals, did nothing, right? But again, to be fair, they're not comparing it to a placebo group, so even if there was an effect of hydroxychloroquine, it may have been missed. But given the New England Journal of Medicine, which did have a control group, there was no difference, right? Okay, so let's take a look at finally the last study, the fifth one. And the title of this one is called Hydroxychloroquine in non-hospitalized adults with early COVID-19, right? And these are patients who were not hospitalized. They were treated at home in an outpatient setting, and it was early on in the disease, right? So in this study, they used 491 non-hospitalized patients that were either confirmed to have COVID or probably had COVID based on symptomology, and they had to be within 4 days of symptom onset. And this is very much similar to the other study. So then they randomized these 491 patients into two groups, right? And then again, this is a nice randomized controlled clinical trial. One arm received hydroxychloroquine and the other arm received placebo, right? And here are the numbers in terms of side effects. They saw that those that received the hydroxychloroquine had almost twice the level of side effects, 43% versus 22. In terms of persistence of symptoms over 14 days, you can say that 24 versus 30%, that 6% is different potentially, but given the almost doubling of the side effects, one can argue one way or another, right? Now, if we look at hospitalization, there was no difference in hospitalization, and there was no effect on mortality, right? So overall, what we can say is that in terms of mortality and hospitalization, there was no difference. There might be a slight decrease in the persistence of symptoms. In other words, the symptoms get better over a 14-day period, about 6%, but overall, in terms of mortality and hospitalization, this group found no difference, right? And again, I've picked these papers because these were the ones that were most recently published in peer-reviewed journals, the other one that I picked was not in peer review. It was undergoing peer review, but it was nonetheless published, so we could look at the data, the raw data, and be able to scrutinize it, right? So of course there are way more papers that one can analyze, but I looked at the latest ones and the ones that have had more time to be more perfectly designed, and wanted to go over the data with all of you, show you the raw data, show you what the scientists and physicians are seeing, and based on that, what interpretations you can have of the overall effectiveness or not effectiveness of hydroxychloroquine, right? So I say that you be the judge of whether hydroxychloroquine is effective or not, right? You be the judge. We went through 5 papers together. I dissected them out. We looked at the details, and again, you could read more. I'll put the link for each of these papers, but maybe then we could have more fruitful discussions and debates about the data, right? Let's talk about the data. Let's look at the weaknesses of each study. Let's look at the strengths, and let's argue about the science and the data, because that's what will give us the answers and progress could be made. Otherwise, we could sit here and argue till we turn blue. We will not have answers if we're not arguing about the data itself. So, like I said, I picked 5, but if there are other papers that you want me to go over, I am more than happy to do another episode on this, or if you want to drop a comment, always welcome. I could address it in the comment section, or you could send me an email. I'll be happy to to discuss that over email. And again, the email address is cytox2.0@gmail.com. Drop a line, send me an email. We can continue having these discussions, and I'll be more than happy to look at any papers that you think I missed and it favors one way or the other, right? I try to be unbiased, look at the most recent data, look at the well-designed studies, and the ones that were peer-reviewed to a certain degree. So with that, hopefully now as a viewer, you are more empowered with data and can understand it and be able to make these decisions and conclusions yourself, right? You be the judge. I just gave you the data. So with that, I want to thank you all for taking the time to watch this video. And once again, I want to remind you, if you can please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of these videos. With that, I want to thank you all again for your time and hope to see you guys in the future in subsequent episodes. Stay safe, be healthy, and have a wonderful day.